Why did Caribbean migrants to Britain remain? There was certainly plenty of people telling them in a range of different ways that they were not welcome. In 1948, when he heard that the Windrush was headed to London with hundreds of black Caribbean passengers aboard, Clement Attlee, the Labour Prime Minister, had tried to have the ship diverted to Africa. In 1964, a Conservative candidate won a marginal West Midlands parliamentary seat from Labour, following a campaign in which his supporters used the slogan that you can see on the slide. In 1968, a member of the Conservative shadow cabinet, Enoch Powell, gave his notorious Rivers of Blood speech, opposing non-white immigration, claiming that black Britons and their children intimidated whites and caused social divisions. Edward Heath, the Tory leader, immediately sacked Powell from the opposition front bench. But that prompted scores of white Britons to protest in Powell's defence, marching on Westminster in solidarity with Powell and to show their agreement with what he had said. Episodes like those helped to show politicians that though obvious and overt racism created unseemly controversy, opposition to immigration nonetheless had widespread public support. By the 1970s, politicians and the press had changed the debate about migration to Britain in two key ways. First, they had nurtured the idea that Britain had an immigrant problem. Second, they had connected that word, immigrant, to non-white arrivals to the country. To be black or Asian in Britain, therefore, meant that you were easily defined as an outsider, an immigrant, and as part of the immigration problem. Politicians soon learned that promises to address this so-called immigration problem could be a vote winner. Partly as a consequence of that, black people often lived in a hostile environment, particularly when it came to the treatment of young black men by the police. And it was tension over heavy-handed policing that led to riots in the predominantly African Caribbean districts of Brixton in London and Toxteth in Liverpool in 1981. Sections of the press represented the trouble as yet another symptom of Britain's immigrant problem, and in tune with long-standing tendencies, newspapers represented migrants and their children as a destructive force. But if you asked them, most Britons were not in the slightest bit prejudiced against black people. And quite a few people did ask them. For example, the white people questioned by the social scientist Michael Banton in the 1950s, they mainly considered themselves to be tolerant of black people. Most told Banton that they were relaxed about black migration to Britain, and they agreed with a statement to the effect that there's no meaningful difference between black and white people. Now, such findings are really important to bear in mind. Many white people in Britain either were not racist or did not consider themselves to be racist. But still, there's a tension here to try to make sense of. Black people were clearly facing appalling prejudice in a country that was, by and large, so it said, not at all racist. How could that be? It's obvious that black people weren't exaggerating their problems. And if anything, if you listen to the oral history testimony of black Caribbean people who migrated to Britain in this period, one of the things that really stands out is that how often they put on a brave face. British racism was rarely so straightforward as the clearly expressed desire for strict racial separation that was voiced in the US South or in apartheid South Africa. In fact, most white Britons, from government ministers to ordinary voters, positively opposed those racist regimes. Before D-Day, hundreds of thousands of American GIs, soldiers from the United States, were stationed in Britain. About 1 in every 10 was an African American. The US military at that time was segregated along colour lines. There were white units and black units, and those few black men who rose in rank were never able to give orders to whites, and all social activities were strictly separate. There was outcry in Britain that US-style racist segregation was practiced by members of the American military on English soil. Outrage when the GIs attacked black men for daring to socialise with white English women. And many owners of pubs and shops went out of their way to welcome black servicemen determined to show their disdain for American racism. In many ways, they were acting in an old tradition. Back in the 1770s, the conservative English writer Samuel Johnson had lambasted the American Revolution with words along the lines of, "Why do we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from these drivers of slaves?" A stinging rebuke to the hypocrisy of slave-holding revolutionaries like Washington or Jefferson. And that spirit had lived on, white Britons showing their support for abolitionism, reading Uncle Tom's Cabin and feeling sympathy for American slaves, supporting those black GIs in the 1940s before cheering on civil rights protesters in South Africa or the US South during the 1960s and afterwards. Most tended to turn a deliberate blind eye to some of the most obvious racial inequalities of their own empire, while feeling proud that there was no official colour bar in Britain. In other words, no overtly racist laws that segregated white from black. The subtleties of British racism were to be seen in the workplace and on the street. Many West Indians recall with bitterness those white colleagues who would work alongside them all week at work and then refuse even to acknowledge them in the pub at the weekend. Navigating that mix of politeness and prejudice was also part and parcel of that most British of activities, house hunting. Many black people, seeing an advertisement for a place to live, would arrive to find a very polite landlady explaining that the room or the flat was no longer available. She likely decided on that excuse when she saw the colour of her would-be tenants, who were in no position to argue back or ask for proof. But even the discriminatory signs and rejections from those hostels or B&Bs that were under more obviously racist management often came with an apologetic story. Just like the employers who said that they were worried about losing their white employees or their white customers if they employed a black person, landladies and landlords would often explain to would-be black tenants that they had to think of their business. What if all of the white tenants left? So when black people went looking for a place to live, they often got to meet people who had no racial prejudices, at least that's what they claimed, but who nonetheless turned them away because of the colour of their skin, blaming their white tenants. In this kind of polite society, where overt racial prejudice was something that was not seen as seemly, it was best to blame it on somebody else. It was undeniable that the housing shortage that black migrants faced was a consequence of systemic racist prejudice. Into the obvious gap in the market jumped landlords who were both non-racist and non-scrupulous. The best known is Peter Rackman, who charged black tenants high rent for poor and overcrowded accommodation in the Notting Hill area of London. Those like Rackman who did allow black tenants in their properties could afford to put their charges sky high and treat their tenants with contempt. Migrants faced immediate violent eviction if they were ever late with the rent money, for instance. One black response to that problem was imported to Britain from the Caribbean, box partner types of savings, which meant people clubbing together, pooling money to help buy houses outright and so escape the clutches of Rackman-style landlords. Not all could afford it, and those who did often still had to settle for old housing in poor districts where families crowded together. But nonetheless, the migrants found homes, and since they were not welcome in pubs and because it was traditional in the Caribbean to drink at home anyway, many British West Indian houses became the place for a party. The famous blues parties, like the one at the centre of Steve McQueen's film Lovers Rock. Through combinations of determination, graft and community solidarity, black pioneers in England found work and lodgings and became, in many cases, British homeowners. At that point, it was time to send for the children. West Indians did not usually migrate to England all at once in family units. It was often young men who came first before they were joined by their wives. And when migrants had children, they were usually left behind in the Caribbean with grandparents or aunts and uncles. The 1960s was a decade of reuniting, or at least of reorganising, these far-flung Caribbean families, as parents sent for children, who then had to say sad farewells to their grandparents and travel to be with mothers and fathers who, in some cases, they barely remembered. By the 1970s, West Indians in Britain were no longer a collection of young pioneering men, but the decision to stay for good was still often left up in the air. Would it be for another 2 years? 5? 10? One child of West Indian migrants remembers coming into the hall to find his parents replacing the wallpaper, and it was at that point, he says, that he knew for sure that they were not going back to the Caribbean. They had become a British family, settled in England for good. In spite of everything that they faced then, Caribbean migrants and their children did find places to live, and they did stay in the country. The reasons have to do both with necessity and choice. Some of the first migrants felt disillusioned and let down and angry by their experiences in post-war Britain. Arthur France, who travelled from Nevis to Leeds in the late 1950s, was amazed when he met other Caribbean migrants who'd had the resilience to remain 1, 2, even 3 years in Britain. He thought they were crazy to put up with it for so long, and recalled that one of them explained to him, well, it's not so much of an active choice. Rather, Britain was a bit like, as he put it, an open prison. The wages from any job you can get are too low to allow you to afford the fare back home. But France himself remained and became a well-known organiser. He helped to set up the Chapeltown Carnival in Leeds, and at a time when English schools often dismissed black students as troublesome and stupid, he helped West Indian families to educate their children at home. He and thousands of other Caribbean migrants not only had the resilience to remain, but also the resourcefulness to survive. 2 significant points can help to explain that kind of staying power. The first is that West Indians worked together to find ways to overcome their problem. The second is that they integrated. English-speaking West Indian migrants could not only communicate with English people, they could also convert them to calypso, reggae, ska, dubstep, dancehall, and more besides, and it was not all one-way traffic either. Most white people were not overtly hostile racists, and it's really important to remember that. A whole lot of white people were simply ambivalent about the Caribbean newcomers. They were not particularly bothered one way or the other. Many became schoolmates and workmates, and some went much further. They were neither hostile nor ambivalent, but they were open and they were welcoming. They became proper colleagues. They became friends and lovers, wives and husbands to West Indian arrivals. Nowadays, a child in Britain under the age of 10 with one Caribbean parent is almost twice as likely as not to also have a white parent. People descended from Windrush generation migrants are now an uncontroversial part of British life. Lenny Henry, a well-known national institution, a comedian from Dudley in the West Midlands and whose parents came to England from Jamaica, sums this up well when he talks about the Trinidadian-born newsreader Trevor MacDonald, the main presenter of the ITN evening news for many, many years. He put it like this: by the end of the 1990s, Trevor MacDonald was not just some black newsreader, he was the newsreader. The single most recognisable newsreader on British television. By the time I was growing up, you could have said the same sort of thing about Lenny Henry himself, the face of BBC's comic relief, or about the BBC newsreader Moira Stewart, the children's TV presenter Floella Benjamin, Ainsley Harriott, the TV chef, athletes like Denise Lewis, Colin Jackson, Linford Christie, the boxer Frank Bruno, or a whole list of England footballers, poets and authors like Benjamin Zephaniah or Zadie Smith, and that list could go on and on and on. Caribbean migrants were always British, of course, and over the years they and their children have become a normal part of life in Britain. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why the Windrush scandal that broke in 2018 was so shocking to many people. In the spring of 2018, it came to light that hundreds of people who had arrived legally in Britain from the Caribbean during the 1960s, most of them as children reuniting with their parents, had found themselves facing deportation, caught up in the hostile environment policies introduced by the Conservative-led coalition government after 2010. Some of them had actually been deported. It was a mistake, a blunder. The Home Office assumed that because people had no paper proof of their right to remain, that they were illegal immigrants. But many of the victims had travelled into the country on the passports of their parents, and that was something that had been perfectly legitimate and legal at the time. It was a traumatising and at times a tragic episode, for which the Home Office has apologised and provided compensation. But the fact that a British government could simply round up and deport scores of black Britons who had arrived in the country decades ago, who had lived and worked in the country legally, paying taxes, bringing up kids, and send them back to Caribbean countries they'd not seen since childhood, now that was deeply disturbing for many, many people. Writers like the journalist Amelia Gentleman, in her book The Windrush Betrayal, have examined this recent episode, and they've tried to make sense of how it could have happened in the first place. For us to do that, one of the things to do is to look at the history behind it. We've been trying to do that in some detail. But even some of the very first responses to the scandal, particularly reactions from black Britons, brought up the historical contexts of racism and resistance. The words of David Lammy, the Labour MP for Tottenham, descended himself from Guyanese migrants, is particularly interesting in that connection. Not only did Lammy choose to link the experience of Windrush generation black Britons to the long history of Britain's involvement with the Caribbean, but he also chose to reference white British anti-racism, dating that back to the abolition movements that started during the 18th century. Here's what Lammy said in a parliamentary debate about the Windrush scandal, and rather than reading it out to you, I'll just finish on this slide so that you can read it for yourself.